Hi, today I'm going to talk about making a variety of different custom clamps for your laser cutter. Hi, welcome to Gray Lightning, my video blog about making things and playing games. And in my last episode, I showed the arrival of my new laser cutter and the process I went through to set it up. The first project I did on my laser cutter was to create these clamps. Now, when I was at a makerspace before I got my own laser cutter, and we had 3D printed magnetic clamps that we used there. So I'm used to using those. And I could recreate those because I do own 3D printers, but I thought, why not do this on a laser cutter so that if you want to recreate it, you can. I use a lot of the same materials in my projects. You see some of the projects here behind me. And I use a lot of 1/8 inch plywood and acrylic, some 1/16 inch, some 1/4 inch. The most common thing I use is this board right here. It's a 12 by 12 1/8 inch piece of Baltic birch plywood. So I wanted to make sure I had clamps to work with that. All of these use these rare earth magnets I ordered on Amazon. And I did a set of corner clamps like this for the 1/8 inch wood. Each one of these have a cutout here that is just exactly, in this case 1/8 of an inch high, so it holds 1/8 of an inch board flat. But I also did a set of 1/16 inch as well, and I labeled them so it was easy to tell which was which when they're stuck there in the side of my machine. I also did some straight ones so that if you have a larger piece of wood, you can put these on the long sides and it'll help hold that board flat on the honeycomb bed. So I did those, and then I did something that I haven't seen in use before, but I thought sounded like a good idea, and that was to make a set of elevated clamps. So they look like this. This is the board, obviously. Here's 4 of them on. They're a very similar design to what I use for the bed itself, but in this case, instead of having the slot for the wood on the bottom, the slot is towards the top. So when you put these on, it elevates the board, sticks to the firmly to the bed, and it does a very good job of preventing that laser bounce back you get from the honeycomb bed that puts little cuts all along the side of your wood and underneath. So you'll see me testing that out. The only problem I had with it was that I have an autofocus on my machine, and the Z sensor, this little pen that sticks on the side, when you focus and it raises back up, it has a very low clearance to the material you're cutting. And it actually hit on the clamps here. So I made a second set based on that. I did 1/16 inch wood on the top. So now instead of sticking up 1/8 of an inch from the material, it's only sticking up 1/16. These actually just clear, so you'll see that. And I also made a set that, not really a clamp, they're more like shelves that you can put on corners that you do have issues with, where the material just fits here and there's nothing that's going to hit the autofocus pen in that location. So I'm going to show how I designed all these in Adobe Illustrator. I'll cut them, assemble them, and I'll show them to you in use. The magnets I'm using come with pre-cut adhesive strips. They're 3 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch thick. The first thing I did was to run some simple tests. So I stuck one of them onto a piece of scrap wood and put it on the bed to see how strong they were, and it really held. A single one would hold the board in place. To test the strength of the adhesive, I put 2 magnets together and stuck them down and pulled it back up, and it stayed beautifully. This is a really simple design project. I always start with any references I need to design around, and in this case it's the size of the magnet. So the simplest way to represent the magnet is to use the rectangle tool. Click on the drawing, enter the dimensions, 60 millimeters and 10 millimeters. It converts them into inches, and this is the size of the magnet. Now, to create a hole that will hold the magnet, You want to use the same rectangle, but make it just a little bit bigger. So I'm going to put in 64 millimeters and 14 millimeters for the dimensions. That gives you a millimeter on each side. I always use red lines for my cut lines and green for my references. And so now I have two shapes here, and if I just grab both of them and use the alignment tools to align them vertically and horizontally, you can see that it's a really tight fit. So that's the hole I want to cut. And really there are two different ways I could draw this outside of the clamp. First, I'm going to make sure that I have snap to grid on, and then I have my pen tool, and I can just click around. Now, if I hold down the shift key, it'll force my lines to go either at a 90-degree or a 45-degree angle. So for something like this, hold down the shift and then just draw the shape that you want for the outside. My preferred method, however, is to use the rectangle tool. And when I see this shape, I see two rectangles together, and that's really how I'm going to draw it. So I just draw the top rectangle, and then I draw the vertical rectangle. And then by holding down the shift, I can select, and using the selection tool, I can select both of those rectangles. And I go to the Pathfinder. I use Pathfinder a lot. And in this case, it's the simplest Pathfinder function. It's unite, and it just turns them into a single shape. So all of the layers of these clamps are either a straight rectangle or this corner piece. And then the only other thing I do is to put engraving on them to help make it easy to pick out the right clamp quickly. And the only thing you really need to remember for text, you put it in place, obviously you size it, you move it to the right location, and then when you're perfectly happy with the way it looks and you're never going to change it again, you want to convert it so the laser cutter can read it. And you do that by going to Type, Create, Outlines. This turns it just into shapes, and it's no longer editable as text. Then I grab one of each shape I need and I pull it into a cut file. Now I need to know how many copies I need to cut of each one. The basic 1/8 inch clamps have two layers, both cut out of 1/8 inch thick wood. The bottom layer has a cutout for the magnet. There are corner versions, and then there's a straight version, as I mentioned, for holding down longer edges on larger pieces of wood. Now the 1/16 inch clamp is a little more complicated because that magnet is too thick to just put it in the bottom like I did for the 1/8 inch. You can hear it shaking around inside. So the center layer is 1/8 inch wood, the top and the bottom are made out of 1/16 inch wood. The first version of the elevated clamp has 5 layers of 1/8 inch wood. The second layer from the top is where the cut-in is to hold the board, and I also just stuck the magnet on the bottom because the height of the magnet isn't really an issue on this design. The second version of the elevated clamp is 4 layers, and the top layer is 1/16 inch wood, and you'll see in a minute why I made these changes. The main goal was to reduce the clamp's profile so it didn't hit the autofocus Z sensor. That's also why I created this shelf version that's just really that last clamp with the top removed. I also wanted to have something small and simple I could drop into parts of the board that were lifting during cutting, and that's what these little leftover tokens on magnets are for. So here's my cut file for 1/8 inch 12 by 12 board, and I'm going to select everything on it, Control All, and I'm going to change the stroke thickness to 0.001, which is what the laser cutter wants to see. And you'll see here, if you look closely, that some of these lines are hardly visible and some of them you can see. And the ones you can see are a problem because that's where Illustrator has created, for some reason, duplicates of a given shape. I've never really found a good explanation for why this occurs, but there's a lot of discussion about it on the internet and how to address it. Lucky for us, if you use Lightburn, when you bring it in, one of the options you'll have available for you is to detect all those duplicate shapes and delete them. So Here I've imported a file, and under the editing option, there's a delete duplicates, and it tells you how many, and you can say yes or no. So I've just deleted them and I save it. I make sure the engraving is happening before the cutting. I set the speed and the power, and I'm ready to go. I didn't screen for duplicates when I did my first clamps, and what you can see here is this is what it looks like. It cuts it one direction, turns around, and recuts it the opposite direction. And it's not 100%. I mean, some of them will be single and some of them will be duplicates, and I don't know why. It doesn't really hurt anything, it just takes longer than it needs to. So here's my first set of clamps. And here they are on my cutter, ready to help me cut my next pieces. I was pretty happy, but I had a couple of issues I needed to address. One was this laser bounce back coming off of the honeycomb, and I want to improve that. And the other was hitting this autofocus. Now, look how close it's tracking. There's very little clearance under that sensor. And given the focal length of my lens, I don't think I can do much about that. My workaround was to use this clamp just to hold the corner of the bottom edge, and then I stacked two 16-inch clamps and used them as a shelf under the top corner. This let me test the concept, and you see here the difference between this one on the right that was flat on the bed and this one on the left in the elevated clamps. Much nicer. So I made a new set. The ones on the right have the 16th inch on the top, so it's thinner and just shelves on the left. And I also reduced the overall elevation, and I'll show you why in just a second, what I was trying to accomplish there. But let's look right now at the clearance issue on the autofocus, and in fact, it does clear the new clamps. I reduced the elevation to try to minimize the flare-ups you get from a piece dropping, rotating under the laser, and burning like this. It happens on these really skinny pieces, and I figure a shorter drop distance, the less likely that is to happen. But even with that flare-up, you see here on the right, the appearance is so much better in the elevated version than the non-elevated. So that's my first project on my new laser cutter. You saw me using these clamps to cut some of the parts of my next project. I have so many fun things I'm going to make. If you want to see them, please subscribe to my channel and turn on your notifications so you know when a new video is posted.